guys, we're ready to continue our study. This week we're in Luke chapter 6. We're covering the first 16 verses. On Monday, we only covered the first 5. And so we saw Jesus being stalked by the Pharisees and the scribes. They're really looking at him on the Sabbath and his disciples to see if they would break the Sabbath law. And I spoke a little bit about what the Sabbath was, but I think it's important too to remember that to really boil down what God intended when he gave them the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20, that it was all about not working and rest, and was all about worship. Make it holy, set it aside. And so everything else that the Jews had added onto that were legalism. They were laws. They had strangled everything good really out of the Sabbath, and they had made it a burden instead of a blessing. And so I like the way one commentator put it, and he said he dropped a bomb. Jesus dropped a bomb in the middle of their Sabbath mentality. Once again, they'd added all this stuff on. And so Jesus was never going to break that you were not supposed to work, and that you were supposed to go to church, you were supposed to worship. And so Jesus always kept that. But those laws they had added in, he's going to drop a bomb on those, and that is going to infuriate the Pharisees and the scribes. And so pick up with me in verse 6, and this is what it says. On another Sabbath, so we're on another Sabbath day, this time he entered the synagogue and was teaching. So he enters the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He's teaching because that was Jesus's primary ministry, was teaching the truth. And so it says, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. And when you read this today with me, there's no way not to kind of allude to the fact that this was a setup, possibly, that maybe the scribes and Pharisees had this man with the withered hand there on purpose. Because look what verse 7 says. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. And so, do you see how the scribes and the Pharisees are watching closely? But does Jesus know this all the while? Yes, he does. And so look what Jesus does. It says, but he knew what they were thinking. Hey, they haven't spoken yet. They're just watching. But the scripture says, but he knew what they were thinking. And he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And he got up and he came forward. And so Jesus knows exactly what he's doing here. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or destroy it? Because you see, Jesus understands fully how warped and how religious these scribes and Pharisees are. He realizes all the while that this might be a setup. He realizes that they're testing him to accuse him, to really destroy him, destroy his ministry. And so he calls them out. And look at the question he asks. He says, is it lawful to do good or do harm on the Sabbath? I mean, what's the answer, guys? Of course, it's lawful to do good. It's lawful to save a life, not destroy one. And so Jesus is going to prove that point here. And he's going to do it publicly. You know, I like that one commentator kind of brought out that could Jesus have waited until the Sabbath was over? Yes. Could he have done this in private and not in public? Yes. But see, he knows this is a teachable moment. And he also is going to confront their error with truth. And so it says, after looking around at them all, you know, can't you just see Jesus looking at every single face in the crowd? And he said, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. And so what did Jesus do? He healed on the Sabbath. Once again, he didn't break that he was not supposed to work. He did not break that it was a day of worship, that it was set aside to be holy. He did good on the Sabbath. And he's already told them, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. There's no such thing as breaking it, because he's the Lord of it. He defines the terms. And so we see him do this publicly. We see him confront their error with truth. And it says, but they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. And so from here on out, we're going to see this upward climb to Calvary, which is going to be filled with the Pharisees trying to accuse, with the Pharisees stalking Jesus and really tormenting him, bringing him all the way to Calvary where he would give his life. It would not be taken. And so we're going to see this escalate with the scribes and Pharisees from here on out. But look what Jesus does next. It says, it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And so after this, you know the drain is real. Do you know that he needs that solitude? You know he needs that time with the Father to refresh and refocus and just have that communion that he has with him. And so he spent the whole night praying. Do you see how he gave up sleep to pray? And he did all of this before he calls the disciples. And so it says, and when the day came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them. So you know that there were more than 12 disciples following him, but he's choosing 12 who he would also name apostles. And you know, disciples and apostles are two different things. You know, the apostles would have the meaning of apostle is ones sent out with unique authority from Jesus. There would only be 12 apostles, and their ministry, it would be involving the history of the church. And so this calling that they had was very, very specific. And so out of all of his followers, out of all of his disciples who are learning and have callings and all those things, there specifically are going to be 12 apostles. And so now he's going to name them. It says Simon, who he also named Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And so when you read this, you know that he called these men. And did he call any Pharisees or scribes? None. Not one. Who did he call? Ordinary men. And you know, I love that one commentator said this. They were from different walks of life. They were from different social, economic statuses. They were from different backgrounds. They had different hometowns. They had different jobs. Do you see how specific Jesus was in calling ordinary men to do extraordinary things? And so when we read this, we know that he called them, and they would learn from him. They would represent him when he went back to heaven. And we know that they would rock the world with the gospel. These ordinary men that he called, when empowered by the Spirit, would take the gospel really around the world. And so we see that he didn't pick scribes and Pharisees. He picked common men. And so as we're kind of ending this section today, you know, there was so much to kind of think about, and the applications, the real takeaways that I want us to think of today are these things. The first thing that we want to notice is that Jesus is our rest. Do we understand that? That Jesus is our rest. That, you know, we should set aside a Sunday, the Lord's Day, to worship and to find rest. But ultimately, every day we have rest in Jesus because he is our rest. He is our refuge. And so that's a wonderful takeaway that we need to remember. Then we need to remember that Jesus attacked error with truth publicly, especially inside the church, guys. I think we see that example here, that, you know, he could have called them aside. He could have not broken that Sabbatarian law that they were talking about, but he chose to confront error with truth publicly. And you know, what were the Pharisees all about? Holding on to error. And so he called it out. And then we need to always remember that prayer is a priority, that we need to be like Jesus, and we need to give up some sleep. We need to set aside specific times to pray, that posture of prayer before a holy God, in great need of him, in great need of that focus and that refreshing that only comes through prayer. So we've seen that here. And then we're going to remember that Jesus chose ordinary men and that they had a specific calling and they were his apostles. And, that would really be, in the Old Testament, there were 12 tribes of Israel. Well, there will be 12 apostles in the New Testament. He already calls out Judas that he would be a traitor, but who's going to take his place ultimately? Paul is going to take his place as that apostle to the Gentiles. So there's so much we can learn as we walk with Jesus through the gospel according to Luke.